Hi guys. So my favorite team to determine what they should do in the off season is the New York Jets. Now this is because they have been pretty mediocre since 2011 or 2013 when they had the Darryl led defense. Um, there's just been blunder after blunder, I feel, and so if I was GM, man, it would be an absolute honor to come in and make a team in New York. You know, that's a huge market. If you have a good New York team, man, you're on top of the world. And yeah, I love scheming up what I think they should do in free agency in the draft and things like that. So I've done a little. I spent maybe 2 or 3 hours just sort of thinking about what they should do, writing down a few notes. So I'll go through my note here on what I think they should do. It's going to be controversial because it's going to require tearing down a fair bit of what they have done in years past. And it's going to be throwing out some evaluations of players that might not be very popular, but I think hold true if you just watch some tape. So first of all, before the draft and free agency, I think it's best to look at the salaries that you've got on the books and see which ones aren't worth it. Which ones are just you're paying a player too much, considering what they actually provide in value. So unfortunately, I think Darnold's contract, while it's not egregiously high, I just think that Darnold is actually not a starting caliber quarterback in the NFL. Now, I said this before the draft last year, and the reason I think this is because he's so damn turnover prone. He's got fumbling issues, and I'm just not sure that his form in the way he throws is conducive to having a great NFL career. I know Phillip Rivers has an unconventional throwing action, but Darnold's is just like, the form's all wrong. I don't think his footwork is great in the pocket. I don't think he can pick up blitzes very well. He can sort of escape out of the pocket and make throws on the run a little bit. He does have the requisite size to take hits in the pocket. But yeah, it's just the mechanics issues. I think his panicking in the pocket can lead to, fumbles and turnovers. I think he can be a solid backup. I value him around $3 million a year. But you see here, he's being paid almost $7 million a year this year, almost 8.5, and then almost 10 mil in 3 years' time. But I think what you have to do, like considering what I believe is that he's overvalued considering his salary and also his draft position. I think because he does still have some hype, considering he's a former 3rd overall pick. He did have a reasonably strong end to last season. I think you need to cash in on that value now and not let another year of average play mean that his value goes down. So if I'm the Jets manager, I'm trading Sam Darnold. Okay. So before we do think about trade scenarios with Sam Darnold, I just want to look and see whether there's any other contracts that might be worth trading. In my eyes, if a player is being paid more than, say, $3 or $4 million a year over what I think they deserve, then they're a trade candidate in my eyes. Just because that money can be used on a replacement player that could be far more valuable, right? So looking along the list, I believe that Kelvin Beachum is being overpaid. I think he's only got 1 year left on his contract. He's proven to be a starting caliber offensive tackle in the past, but I just think that I think you need a little bit more assurances on the edge there as an edge protector and have more of an impact in the run game. And looking at some of the offensive tackle talent that is available in the draft and free agency, I believe that he can be replaced. And so, I value him around $4 million a year, so a quality backup, but unfortunately, I wouldn't have him pegged as a starting caliber tackle. So he's being paid $9.5 million. I think that it's wise to trade that contract. Okay. So we'll have him as a potential trade candidate. And this contract here, Leonard Williams is worth his contract. I think he's an absolute beast. Trumaine Johnson's contract is one of the most confusing contracts, befuddling contracts, I think, I've ever seen. Trumaine Johnson's like 28 years old, and he's going to be paid $18.5 million in 3 years' time. That contract needs to go. So I think if you can package Trumaine Johnson, I mean, I'm all about paying your cornerbacks, but he was the wrong cornerback, I feel. And they've letting Darryl Roberts test free agency, who he's proven to be a really good corner. Morris Claiborne was a pretty good corner. He's going to be let go as well. Terrence Brooks was a good safety who could maybe defend in the slot or something every now and then. He's been let go. And you're paying Trumaine Johnson. He was a pro bowler, so that comes with a reputation. But when you look at his actual production on the field, he's giving away big plays. He's a physical corner. So he can match up with a Julio Jones, maybe at the line of scrimmage if you jam him or something, but maybe not so much keeping up with him in space. Trumaine Johnson's just gave up way too many big plays for the Rams, and the Rams let him go willingly. So to pay him that kind of money, I think is ludicrous. But, if you have a trade package of Sam Darnold, teams are going to fall over themselves for that sort of package because he does come with that, top billing reputation. So let's package Trumaine Johnson, Kelvin Beachum, and Sam Darnold into a trade package. Now, there are a few teams that I think that would want a guy like Sam Darnold. He is the most attractive player in this deal. So a team like the Cowboys might want to have a more long-term prospect rather than Dak Prescott, who has had his own issues with things like accuracy. So they might want to bring in a quarterback like Darnold, right? Another team. So just look at my notes here. I did make some notes in Google Keep here. So the Broncos, I think the Broncos deal could be the most attractive. The Giants might look at Darnold. Picking up him up in a trade rather than using draft capital might be a good option for them. Although I think they would have to offer a draft pick with the kind of package that I would want. I'm analysing the other team's roster to see what kind of players I would actually want to get back in the trade for Darnold. So the Giants adding Carl Lauletta, who I think can be a borderline starter in the NFL. He was from last year's draft. Lorenzo Carter, who's an outside linebacker who's got wicked speed around the edge and can defend guys in space and things like that. And BJ Hill, he's quite a good defensive tackle prospect. Those are guys I think I would want back from the Giants. And then the Jaguars, Cody Kessler, I think he proved in his time with the Browns that I think he's probably a starting caliber quarterback. And the Browns, constantly cycling through quarterbacks, they let him go. The Browns had Josh McCown, who had a good year with the Jets just last year, and of course he was benched for Sam Darnold. Yannick Ngakoue, he's been a Pro Bowl, I believe, and he's a menace off the edge. I know that the Jets are currently running a 3-4 scheme, but I think because they don't have many players on their books at the edge position, you could actually change that to a 4-3. So if you bring in Ngakoue, I think it's sensible to start a 4-3, and then you potentially bring in Miles Jack as well. The Jaguars might be willing to give up those guys for a guy like Sam Darnold because the Jaguars have had this perceived issue at quarterback, having Blake Bortles for a few years. But looking at the Broncos offer, I think, I'm not sure, from a Broncos point of view, I'm not sure if they do it, but quarterback is so highly valued that you might be able to pull this off. Philip Lindsay, I actually didn't scout him at all last year. He was off my radar. I scouted like 160 players last year. I'll put a link to my WordPress blog, my big board, just to see where I rank for certain players. Philip Lindsay wasn't on my board, and he absolutely broke out and balled out. I think he's the kind of back he can even play in short yardage situation because he's got such good burst, and he's short but he's got solid size. But he can play in the passing game, a bit of pass protection, and then obviously the running game. So he can be your go-to running back for the Jets. So you bring in Philip Lindsay, Deshaun Hamilton. I think he was picked in the 3rd or 4th round by the Broncos last year and used a little bit. I mean, the Broncos were stacked at wide receiver with Emmanuel Sanders, Cortland Sutton. So Deshaun Hamilton didn't get all that much of a run, but I had him as my top wide receiver in the draft last year. Just the shorter guy like Antonio Brown, but he can play at all the spots. and he can be a threat after the catch. He's got great route running, great hands. He's the Penn State receiving yards leader of all time. So that says something. And yeah, I think he's an absolute weapon. Ronald Leary at guard, he's a veteran. He's being paid about $9 million a year. So I think the Broncos might want to shed themselves of that, even though they are bringing Beachum and Trumaine Johnson. But, the Broncos do have a bit of a question at tackle with Jared Veldheer being injured, and Garrett Bowles maybe not doing as good a job at tackle as his draft billing expects. So maybe bringing in Beachum is a good idea. And also Trumaine Johnson, they got rid of Aqib Talib. Maybe Johnson, he's being paid an exorbitant amount, but if the Broncos can come to terms with that, considering they have Sam Darnold, then maybe they'd be willing to do that as well. And then Josie Jewell, the Broncos had a great draft last year. Josie Jewell, I think, is a really good linebacker. So, he can come in and start right away for the Jets, I believe. Even though, if you've got Darren Lee and Avery Williamson, who I think are starting caliber linebackers, and Josie Jewell, that's a linebacker trio that in a 4-3 defense could really make a huge impact. I'll just pause this video just to double check that the Broncos even have the cap space, because that's only like $12 million in salaries there. And I'm not sure if they have the cap space to take on Darnold, which is like $6 million, Beachum, which is $9 million, which makes 15, and then Trumaine Johnson, which is 12, which will make $27 million. So that, basically, they have to have the caps around. So what's that? So my maths is all out of whack. 27 minus 12. 15. So the Broncos would have to have $15 million in cap space for this to happen. So I'll just pause and see if the Broncos do have the space for that. All right. So I'm just looking at the Broncos salaries here. So yeah, they have $15 million in cap space, which is just right there at the limit of what they could take on in a trade. Emmanuel Sanders, they might look to cut, and there'd only be $2 million in dead money. Sanders is still a pretty good wideout, so I'm not sure they'd do that. They've talked about letting Brandon Marshall go as well. There's a fair bit of dead money associated with that deal, though, so I'm not sure if that's such a wise idea. So, look, the Broncos might just be so desperate for a long-term quarterback that they are willing to basically be right at the limit of the salary cap. No, this team cap space of 36 mil, sorry. I read further down or read on another page that it was less. But yeah, so they can basically fit in this trade. You've got Case Keenum and Joe Flacco combining for $36 million per year in salaries. So you'd have to do something with Keenum or Flacco. I think Case Keenum's actually pretty decent. Maybe not worth that sort of contract, but so look, I've not posed this trade idea to any Broncos fans, so maybe I should post in Broncos Reddit to see if that's a trade that they'd be willing to do. But let's just assume that this trade goes ahead. From the Broncos' point of view, they're getting their future quarterback. They're getting Ronald Leary's contract off the books. And Josie Jewell and Deshaun Hamilton were just mid-round picks, so maybe they don't value them all that much, considering that Sam Darnold was the 3rd overall pick. And they do get Kelvin Beachum and Trumaine Johnson, who can be serviceable, proven veterans. So that's the point of view from the Broncos. So let's go with that, right? So that trade has gone through. So what do the Broncos then do in free agency? Well, actually, before that, let's think about further trades that could happen. So all the guys on the roster that we now have, I think, are worth the contracts that they're being paid. So let's analyze what, and also that trade did free up $15 million in space. So what do we do with that $15 million? Well, let's just see where holes might be on the roster. Okay, so we need a starting quarterback and a backup quarterback. We've got Crowell, who I think can be in a rotation for running back. So can Maguire. I'm not so sure about Trent and Cannon. But having Philip Lindsay in there, I think the running back position is set. Offensive line, no, that needs a lot of work. Okay, I think Brian Winters is worth his contract. I think Brandon Shell is pretty solid, but I think he should be the backup tackle. And then there's really no one else on the offensive line. So apart from Ronald Leary, who you picked up in that trade, so basically center and the two tackle positions are going to need to be invested in. Defensive line, Nathan Shepherd, I think, is an absolute beast. Great pick from the Jets last season. I've never, the guy of his size with the amount of burst he has off a line and the strength to push guys away, that's awesome. And Leonard Williams there. Now, as I mentioned, it does depend on what the Jets do in terms of scheme. They might want to stick with the 3-4 scheme or move to 4-4-3. So we'll just have a look at who's available in free agency, just to see whether they want to stick with 3-4 or go to 4-3. But maybe defensive tackle isn't really a position of need at the moment. Linebacker is sorted because you've got Josie Jewell, Avery Williamson, Darren Lee. Jordan Jenkins, I think, is probably a backup on the edge. Terrell Basham's the same. Jamal Adams, he's an awesome pick. He's going to be an all-pro safety, Rashad Robinson's okay, really good size from a cornerback, but maybe not quite starter level at the moment. For me, a starter needs to be worth around $6 million a year. That's just a figure I have in my head to be serviceable as a starter. Marcus May, great safety. So the safety spots are definitely tied up. But unfortunately, cornerback is a huge need. So that's going to have to be addressed. Special teams, I think you definitely bring back Jason Myers. Jason Myers was with Justin Tucker and what was that? Aldrich Rojas from the Giants. I think they were the best kickers in the NFL. You have to bring Jason Myers back at kicker. I forgot to mention here Chris Herndon. I think he's a pretty good tight end. I think he was a really good pickup. So I think, I personally think you've got to have two starting caliber tight ends. Just because it's been proven to work with the Patriots and things like that. So if you can pick up another tight end in free agency or the draft, that would be awesome. And then looking at wide receiver, we have Quincy Enunwa, Robby Anderson, and you brought in Deshaun Hamilton. So those are three guys that I think are definitely starter quality. So they use this Robby Anderson. So if someone wants to sign Robby Anderson in free agency, they have to give up a second round pick. So I'm not sure if that's going to happen. So they're just paying him $3 million a year next year. Quincy Enunwa got that nice extension. He's a pretty good receiver. So the receiver spot doesn't really need a lot of help. But look, basically the point of this whole line of thinking was to say that if a talent like Antonio Brown is on the market for potentially cheap and you have suddenly $15 million in cap space from this trade, I think you've got to go after Antonio Brown. So, that will mean that Robby Anderson or Enunwa will be on the bench, rotational receiver, considering I think Deshaun Hamilton is better than both of those guys. Maybe, you could trade Robby Anderson or Enunwa, but actually Anderson's more likely because he's got less years on his deal, so you might as well cash in, and you've spent a lot of money on Enunwa already. So I think you'd trade for Antonio Brown. Now, what's it going to take? Look, the Steelers are probably selling low. Maybe you could take a third or fourth round pick. I'd only probably trade a fourth round pick, but the Steelers might take that. And, the Steelers could take back a guy like Robby Anderson as well in that trade to add value. So maybe Robby Anderson and a third round pick. Let's say trade Robby Anderson a third round pick for Antonio Brown. I'm not sure if that's allowed in the rules considering this whole second round tender on Robby Anderson. Or maybe, you trade a Enunwa. So let's assume that Anderson and a third round pick is traded to the Pittsburgh Steelers for Antonio Brown. Now, I haven't spoken to any Steelers fans about whether they think that is a trade that they'd be willing to take, but maybe I'll pose that to them. I'll just write these down. So Steelers, Brown for Anderson and a third. Now the Jets do have 2 third-round picks. I think one their own as well as the Saints. So yeah, hold on. I'll just pause to see what sort of how many years Brown has on his contract. Okay, holy moly. Brown has a super cheap deal until 2021. He will be 33 years old, but I'm not sure if that will be a huge concern, because he's such a great player in terms of finesse. So he's not taking huge hits all that often. And he has such a great work ethic. I think he can still be tremendously impactful at that age. So, getting Brown for that sort of deal, I think that could be absolutely an absolute steal. So, as I mentioned, I might run these trades by Steelers fans. What was the other trade? Oh, yeah, the Broncos. The Broncos trade. So I might post in like the Broncos and Steelers Reddit, and I'll update the YouTube description of this video to see what they thought. I mean, anytime I've posted anything on Reddit, I sort of get torn apart, maybe for good reason. I don't know. These are just my thoughts. But it's interesting to get the discussion rolling about what you guys might do with these teams off seasons. So trade Robby Anderson in a third round pick to the Steelers for Antonio Brown. Okay. So now that the wide receiver spot is completely stacked, let's get in, and there's no more trades that need to be done before free agency or the draft. Maybe you want to move up in the draft, actually, but those sort of trades can happen later. And it also, you might be able to use players that are expendable because of what you've done in free agency to move up in the draft as well. So we can talk about that once we get to the draft. But of course, in the NFL, unlike the NBA, free agency happens before the draft. So let's just look at my NFL free agent big board and see who the Jets might like to sign in free agency. Now, do keep in mind that the cap space is at around $99 million, even if you take on Antonio Brown. So, the Jets suddenly, they need a quarterback, they need a better offensive line, and they need better cornerbacks and edge defenders. So basically, I expect the Jets to spend that much money on those positions. So, that's what happens when you have a roster that's kind of depleted of talent. You need to, you might have cap space, but it's like, what are you spending it on? So in this case, we need to spend that money in a big way. So let's look at the free agency big board and see who we might like to sign. Okay, so as you can see, at the top of my board is the offensive tackle from the Carolina Panthers, Darryl Williams. I value him at $14 million a year. I think, he's only 26 or so. He's an absolute beast at tackle. PFF grades him very highly, and I agree with them. I think he's just, an athletic freak, and he can really protect and run block, basically the prototypical offensive tackle. So I think, $14 million is the maximum I would spend on him, which would be a huge contract. That might even be bigger than Nate Solder's offensive tackle contract, which was the biggest for an offensive tackle in league history last season for the Giants. But look, bring in Darryl Williams. How much can you get Darryl Williams for? Because, you might value him at 14 mil, but if you can get him for cheaper, maybe you just offer, maybe 4 years, $8 million per year. That's what I would offer to the offer Darryl Williams. And look, the Panthers just haven't really prioritized bringing back their stud offensive line talent. They let Andrew Norwell go, and they might let Darryl Williams go as well. So I think you can snag Williams there. So let's say that we sign Darryl Williams to an $8 million a year deal. At guard, I think the Rams aren't going to be able to bring back Roger Saffold because we do have actually our guard spots are pretty good. So basically, when you think about bringing in free agents, which is what the Patriots have done, I've read a few books about what the Patriots' strategy is with free agency in the draft. It's like you compare your current players to players that you could potentially get. So at the moment, I think with Ronald Leary and Brian Winters, I think the Jets do have starting caliber guards. So maybe it's better to invest the money initially anyway on positions of need, right? So offensive tackle is a position of need. The difference between Brandon Shell and Darryl Williams is huge. And besides, at the moment, it's only Brandon Shell who's really the offensive tackle guy for the Jets anyway. So bringing in Darryl Williams is hugely important. Running back is set with Philip Lindsay. Safety's fine with Jamal Adams and Marcus May. Cornerback is a huge need. And look, this is a hot take because Tarvarus McFadden went undrafted in last year's draft. But I think he was the top cornerback in the whole damn draft. Athletic freak for a guy his size. Didn't have awesome top-line speed, but, I don't think that really held him back too much. His freshman year, it was freakish. He was billed as like a top prospect in the draft, but then he dropped off a little bit. I think there was some injury problems, and he, rather than getting interceptions, he more had deflections. But that's good enough for me. So unfortunately, I do think that he is on some sort of contract with the 49ers. So I'll just do a quick little bit of research and figure that out. Okay, so McFadden is available. He was on a tiny contract last year, but he is available. So bring in Tarvarus McFadden. You can probably get him for $2 million a year. I'd sign him to like a 3-year, $2 million a year deal. That's my starting cornerback right there. He can be cover the X receiver. So yeah, bring in McFadden. Here's my top edge defender in free agency, Preston Smith. Like he can play in the 4-3 or 3-4 just because of his impressive size. But I think outside linebacker is his better position, just because he has been playing that for the Redskins. And those Redskins do have pretty good talent already. Like Ryan Kerrigan holds down the edge there, so they might not be breaking the bank to keep Preston Smith, especially because they might be going younger. With Alex Smith's injury, they might be going. They might be in a position to just tank and get high draft picks for next season. So bringing back Preston Smith wouldn't really help in that regard. But before we think about the edge, I think we need to sort of look at the talent elsewhere and then get back to that because with the whole scheme problem. As I mentioned, you've got 2 starting caliber defensive tackles, but really no other talent on the defensive line. Although you do have those 3 linebackers. Maybe the Jets have to transition to a 4-3. I think, I'm going to commit to the Jets transitioning to a 4-3 defense because you've got those 3 really good linebackers, and we can pick up a couple of good defensive ends in free agency. Now, Preston Smith, I think I value him at about $12 million a year in at the outside linebacker spot because he does provide value, defending in space a little bit. When I say defending in space, I mean like defending running backs on screens and things like that, or in the passing game, and maybe even guarding tight ends a little bit. And Preston Smith, I think, can do that. Defensive end, where you're just a pure pass rusher, and you also have to defend against the run. So you have to be around the 270-pound mark, whereas Preston Smith is a bit less than that. I think he's maybe worth around $8 million a year at defensive end. So, that brings him down the board a little bit. Maybe we'll just keep our eye on Preston Smith, but not really go for him as yet. Here's the other awesome Jet free agent prospect in free agency, Trent Brown of the Patriots. I think he's absolutely huge. proven left tackle for a championship winning team. He was great for the 49ers, and then they let him go for like a third round pick because he had weight issues. But look, if you can play, you can play. And I'd be offering Trent Brown $11 million a year because I think the Patriots would like to bring him back, even though they do potentially have Isaiah Wynn coming in. He was a draftee last year at tackle. I think, you're going to have to break the bank for Trent Brown. So I'd give him maybe like